So let me introduce you. On the end, we have Andrea. Andrea's come from Wales today. Then we have Jane. Jane's from Manchester. Michael's come all the way from Scotland. And Jan has come from Yorkshire. So as you can see, they've come from quite a distance. I actually work with Rudolph and I lead the patient public involvement group, although I would say they actually lead themselves and lead me. But and I come from Cambridge. So the first question they wanted me to ask you actually was, can you put your hand up if you've actually worked with a patient public involvement group before, whether you actually worked with a patient public involvement group or with a research advisory group before? They just wanted to have an interest, a show of hands. So quite a few have, but quite a few haven't. So that's really interesting. So I'm just going to move over here and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how this group came together. And there are actually 14 of them altogether, and obviously 4 of them have come today. So I think that, yes, that's the next slide. Oh, I can't read that from here. So what we wanted to do, as Anne said, is part of DataMind, we wanted to bring a research advisory group together because DataMind is quite a bitty project in that there's lots of work streams involved in it. And so we wanted to bring people from across the country together to help out with those different work streams, knowing that some of those work streams are also work with their own patient public involvement groups. And so when we went out to advert, the things we thought about in our advert was who should be part of this group. And we asked that people had an interest in mental health research that uses health data. We asked that they had a personal experience of a mental health illness or a carer of someone who had that mental health illness. We asked people whether they had experience or not. And I think part of a patient public involvement group or a research advisory group or a RAG, as we call it, it doesn't matter whether people have got experience or not. I think that's one thing that we really considered. And actually, 5 of our members had no previous experience of being part of a research advisory group. We mentioned what skills we thought people had, but we didn't want them to have skills, really, not too many skills, because it puts people off. And obviously, we wanted to think about diversity and how we could make the group more diverse. And actually, we look a very undiverse group here. But don't forget that some people have diversity that we can't see in a person. And we do have other members of the group who aren't here today. And some of the reasons they aren't here today is that perhaps they didn't want to come because they didn't want to be as sort of, in front of people. And I think that's something we should think about when we're putting together research advisory groups, and something we can maybe chat about later. We also mentioned in our advert the time commitment, that people should respect views of others, the training and support we could offer, and something that's really important in patient public involvement is payments and what you're going to pay people, because it's really important that these people are paid for their time. Coming today, it's 2-day commitment. We all came up last night. We had a few glasses of wine, which was fantastic. But they've had to come up on train yesterday from Scotland, from Wales, from all over. So I think that's something you really need to think about. The other thing we thought about in our application process was, what if people can't fill in an application form? What about accessibility and disability? And we made it quite clear that people didn't have to fill in an application form in. They could talk to us by telephone or on a Zoom call. Again, another important thing we did. And again, we had to think of considerations if what people don't have online connection. And again, we offered things like if someone could go to a library, we could book them a space in a library and they could make an online collection. Then what we did is we invited to interview. And one of the things that I think we wouldn't do again is we wouldn't use the word interview, because it definitely put some people off. And I had to persuade a couple of people to come to an interview. So we called it a chat in the end. Come and have a chat with Rudolph and myself about the group. So that's something I would change. We also asked that people could consider the needs of a broad range of people affected by mental health conditions. And again, I think if I put this group together again, I wouldn't say that. Because what we want is these people to speak individually about their individual experiences, and not about that they speak on behalf of other people, because everybody has an individual experience. So again, that's something I would not put in an advert. I would leave that out. We did want people to have good communication skills, but then again, we could debate what's a good communication skill, particularly if, for example, lots of mental health illnesses that mean you don't have good communication skills. So again, another thing to debate. But we did want people to be able to give us constructive feedback in any way that they could. And one of the things that was really important to us, and one of the things that really stood out in the applications that we asked for, was one of the questions. We only asked 3 questions in the application. One thing we asked is, how will you share the experience with your community? And everybody who applied for this research advisory group told us about their communities and what they were going to do, which gave us a really good idea of how we could get into other communities. So again, it's something that I think if you were putting together a research advisory group, I'd really endorse that you use that. And I just wanted to share one of the comments from one of our group who can't be here today. And their comments that they said about being part of the group was, they said, I belong to a number of marginalised and underserved groups and wanted to have a voice. There have been many occasions in the past where I've been overlooked or not taken seriously, whereas the DATAMIND RAG seemed like an opportunity to meaningfully contribute and have impact, both on a personal level and hopefully to help others in my community have their needs considered too. And so I think what we did, that sums up, hopefully, that we have got a group that thinks as we hope they will think and help us, and as Anne mentioned, you know, to help us throughout DATAMIND. So I'm going to stop there because you haven't come here to hear me. You've come here to hear these wonderful people over here. So I do have a question I want to ask them first, and then we have a bit of a plan as to how we're going to go. It's all written down, as I say, I wasn't prepared to chair this, so we're just going to wing it and hope that we get there. So the first question that we had thought about, and what these guys had really asked James or me to ask them was, what made you apply to become a member of the DATAMIND group? And I'm just going to turn to Jan because she's here first.
I applied for this role because I thought about it, and large parts of my life have been defined by mental health, both mine and the people around me. We've all had different degrees of success in our care, our treatment, and the services that we've been able to access or not. DATAMIND provided me with the opportunity to improve, hopefully, care services and treatment for people with mental health issues. And listening to the voices of people with lived experience in real time, with real experience, is an incredibly powerful thing. And being able to harness that to improve the studies and the research and the projects that you're doing is a skill that both the PPI person has to learn and the researchers themselves have to learn. And that dynamic experience is huge. And I wanted to do a lot of exploration of that. From a personal level, my project management and background in employment, I found very useful in looking at developing ways for the PPI group to access the research and become more involved, even if it was practical things like developing spreadsheets and those type of things. So those are my reasons.
Jane is my spreadsheet guru. And Michael isn't. Michael doesn't like spreadsheets.
Let's see, probably about 15 years ago, I discovered I had a mental health. I'm pretty sure I had one before, but at this point I realized that it actually mattered quite a lot. And that, that journey of, dealing with depression, of also discovering that I was quite neurodiverse and had ADHD, and the impact that had on my life and the lives of the people around me, but also in understanding all that and working through those things, I began to understand that other people had mental health too, and they affected them, and in some cases quite drastically, and watching the effects of suicide and the impact that had on people. So I mean, my whole life changed because I started dealing with these things, and I started working in mental health. I now work in AI and digital mental health for my day job. And when this opportunity came along, it seemed like a great chance to really be involved in the appropriate development of data around mental health that can support people. And in particular, I think for me, two areas. One is inclusion in a very broad sense, because quite often the people who have mental health issues are not people we might want to include in conversations, but we damn well should. And engagement, that there's so, that everybody has a mental health, and helping people to engage with it, whether it's around their own personal development or developing data, is so important and so bloody difficult.
Thank you, Michael. Jane, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, similar, I suppose. I grew up with a number of people in my family with mental illness. So I grew up with an older brother with schizophrenia from a young age, and I still care for him. I share care for him. And then more recently, 5 years ago, my youngest daughter, who's autistic, developed severe anorexia and nearly died, and then spent 4.5 years in hospital and under eating disorder services in Manchester. And where I learned how to help her really was not from all the academic stuff, which I did read, and she had a fantastic team. We were very lucky with Manchester, fantastic community team as well. But it was from reading lived experience books. It was from reading, two in particular that just talked about, what they did, everything that really helped me. So that really brought home to me as well how important it was. And I suppose I'm one of the people, I'd had 15 years working as a volunteer in patient involvement already with charities and with NIHR, because I have 2 autoimmune diseases that I've had since I was very young, for which there is no cure. So I'd been very involved in and very passionate about pushing the patient voice in research already, but there wasn't the opportunity to do that in mental health to the same extent, partly because of who funds mental health research tends to be universities. There isn't the kind of charity sector involvement. So when this came along, I was just, I thought, oh, this is fantastic. This is what I really want to do. And I've worked here with DATAMIND, but I also work locally with eating disorder services with parent groups as well, and develop resources for the community, especially around, more recently, an example would be, for people who are having to have nasogastric tubes, but in the community because there's no longer enough beds, just to sort of support information to support patients and their carers and not make it so scary, that kind of thing. So yeah, DATAMIND just kind of brought everything together for me, really.
Thank you, Jane. And I think we should especially welcome Andrea today. Andrea's come from Wales, but this is one of the first times that Andrea's been able to come out since the pandemic, and certainly she's had some other illnesses which she may mention. But so we're especially grateful that she's been able to come today, and it's been quite a challenge getting here, but she's here, yes. And we're really welcome that she's here. So yeah. I don't know if you perhaps want to say why you joined DATAMIND, Andrea.
Yeah, to start with mental health, you tend to stay away from it because it's always been a taboo subject or whatever. But my son was actually very suicidal, and also other different problems that I was witnessing due to dyslexia. So this is how the mental health path actually grabbed hold of me, really, because I wanted to know so much and to support my son. However, with working through this, it unravelled all the things that I've been putting on the burner because of my own my childhood. I didn't realise that I was suffering through mental health, through abuse, feeling unworthy of things. And of course, like, I've always tried to challenge things in a bizarre way, because everyone would say, like, I'm like the black sheep of the family. But my main task was actually fighting for my son. And through that, I was actually going through quite a lot of training. And my employment is Mental Health Act office. So, of course, I learned all about the policies and everything. And I just want to help others, not help, it's empowering really others, because this is what I had the main role for my son. So with actually going through firsthand with my son, it actually helped me to understand my my health is actually sadly sort of controlled by rheumatoid arthritis. And I've had 2 lots of sepsis, and I'm still not ready to go. So I was determined that I was going to come down here and show that I still have worth, and I still want to be able to, challenge what is, what we need to change. And the only way of changing is education. And, it's all right blaming them, blaming that and whatever. Our NHS service as well. But you've got to be strong, and you've got to think what you're doing, whatever little bit you're doing, is actually helping others not to go through what you've endeavoured. So when I actually saw this opportunities to join DATAMIND, I wanted to enhance my learning, but also be able to share my experience in order to be able to help others.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you everybody for sharing, publicly their experiences, which we're really grateful for. So thank you. At this point, we would just like to start to throw any questions open to the audience. We have got some further presentations to do, but if there's any questions that anyone would like to ask, please do raise your hand. I can see a lady over here. Might be a microphone coming. Oh, yes. There's a lady just at the front here.
Well, thank you so much for being here and letting us learn from your experience. I guess my question is, a few of you have mentioned that you've also got physical health problems, and it's whether you think this particular mental health group that you're in, whether you are able to share the whole of your experience, so the kind of holistic problems of having a physical health problem as well as a mental health problem.
Yes,
because it is specifically mental health, but I know that there's so much more, isn't there, in having good mental health.
Yeah, I think the main thing is to be positive, even though it's very tough. But I've been involved in my local health board, and you've got mental health and you've got physical. You cannot have it together. But how many people, maybe in this room, that sits right in the middle there? So even in my unit, if you have a medical situation, you're not able to have the mental health because you have to go. So this is what we've got to be able to, by data, educate people and be able to explain how it becomes a problem to the individuals. And it's again the social model and the medical model that we need to put together.
And I think also I know I have a couple of long-term conditions and I get reasonably good treatment for that, but if I say to my doctor, either in primary or secondary care, my consultant, I'm really depressed, they'll just say, well, of course you are, I'd be depressed if I had what you've got, and that has actually been said to me. It's never given a priority, and yet the majority of people who have more than one long-term condition will develop depression at some point. I mean, the evidence is there, and equally with mental health and poor physical health, we know that, but it's not joined up, and services work in these silos. So actually DATAMIND is a great place to talk about that.
And just to say as well that we are actually working with, I can't remember which road builder it is now, 5 maybe?
5 is what came to my head, David Osborne.
And David Osborne, who is working, so we have been involved in some of the work that they're doing. So that involves serious mental illness and physical health, and we've been asked to look at a project that they're doing. So we do feel that the two are coming together. I think there was a question just in the middle. We'll just take one question because we just want to, we've got lots of time, but we've got, oh, right. Going to hold off just for a second. We'll move on to the next bit and then we'll come back to you after the end of the next one, just so I don't get waved at too much about time. So trying to do my emergency chair bit. So I'm going to invite Jane to speak next. One of the things we were asked to think about some of the things that we would like to present to you today. And one of the things that the group came up with was the idea of impact and the value and impact of patient-public involvement. So Jane is just going to speak on that.
I'm going to speak briefly. I've got my phone here so I can quickly check. Because impact we could talk about all day, but hopefully we get a sense. So I'm just going to start with this cartoon, and it's a funny cartoon, but it's about the importance of talking to the end user. And if only that poor baby could have been in our super research advisory group, then he or she would have a much better experience of lying for hours in that cot. And that's quite fundamental. If you don't start by asking the end user, of your research, the people who are actually going to be benefiting from it, hopefully, then you're probably not going to make your research as relevant and as sustainable and as impactful as it could be. So that's, you know, the first point. And because of that, really important to get people in right at the beginning of your research, before your research, even asking people what's important to them, you know, what would make the big difference to their life. And I know some of the work I've done, research has changed because patients have said, well, you know, what you're researching is all very well, but actually what matters to us as a community is this. And often that's been a shock to researchers. I also have rheumatoid arthritis, and I know for years it was cure and pain. And then suddenly people were saying, actually, you know, it's fatigue. Fatigue is a really big issue for us, even when we're well controlled. And so suddenly the research community started to put money into that. So if you don't actually ask people what matters to them, then your research is not going to be as impactful. But once you actually do research, and it was really heartening to hear earlier about all the people who are already involving patients with lived experience, people with lived experience, what are the general impacts? When most people think about the impact on the project itself, the impact on the research, and there is considerable evidence, because I know you're all researchers, a lot of you, and you go by evidence, but there's considerable evidence now that involving people with lived experience at every stage, or at any stage even, but better if you can do it at every stage, actually makes research much better. So from design of research right through to involving patients and helping get good evaluation of the impact of research, we know now that it will improve outcomes. It improves both the design, it improves the methodology, and it makes research much more likely to be taken up. And it also makes it much more cost effective, because if you can involve patients in keeping participants in a clinical trial because of their own experience of what's worked for them, then you know your trial is going to work. You're not going to have to repeat it. So very, very important. Also, I think, and this was alluded to before, it's an ethical imperative. You know, we live in a democracy still, as far as I know today, and it should be really a principle then that those people who are affected by research should have a say in how that research is done and should be involved in that research. So even leaving aside the benefits for researchers, I think, you know, as an ethical issue, it's very important. But what about the impact on the people involved? And I just want to say something about the impact on I've used the word patients there, but patients for shorthand for people with lived experience, whether you're a carer or even, you know, a stakeholder, a member of the public in another group. And I think that it has a great deal of impact. I mean, firstly, I think if you are living with or caring for someone with any illness, but particularly a mental illness, your life can just feel like a series of losses. You know, it could just be one loss after another, whether it's employment, relationships, whatever. And what involving people with lived experience does is enable them to use their experience and our experience in a positive way, to actually make a positive difference. So suddenly people want to know about your experience. It's not something to be kept quiet or to mean that you can't work or you can't do this, but it's actually something very positive. And that reframes, it allows the individual to reframe their experience and see it in a much more positive way. It also gives you a lot of peer support. You know, already as a group, we've enjoyed working together. And, you know, I've developed many, many relationships that are very strong in my life and that have got me through very difficult times through meeting people with similar conditions and similar situations. It also allows you to develop new skills, lots of skills. You know, I worked in education all my life, but I've lots of other skills that I've developed being involved in research. But it's a two-way street. I've also worked training researchers and hopefully helped them develop skills that they didn't have and given them knowledge. So there is that whole kind of teaching, learning going on between you in your relationship. And it can increase agency and confidence if it's done well. Impact on researchers, you know, because many researchers think, oh, well, you know, it'll benefit my project, or let's face it, I have to do it because I won't get the funding.
if I don't tick the boxes. We still get that attitude. But you know, I've discovered in the 15 years I've done it that it has a lot of impact on researchers as well. And one of the biggest things, and this has been alluded to, is it changes conversations. You know, if you have people with lived experience in a room discussing research, you will find over time, particularly if you're doing it regularly with the same group, that people change how they talk. They're no longer so defensive about their particular discipline. You're asking these kind of emperor's new clothes questions, you know, and you're allowed to do that because, you know, you're just a patient, but that frees everybody else up to kind of say, oh, never thought about that, and to ask those questions in a very different way. And I found that people just loosen up, they just start collaborating far more, they talk differently. And that can really encourage collaboration and openness in how people work. It also makes researchers much more reflective on their practice, as it should do, and that can be a very, very positive thing. Because we're kind of forcing them to ask the questions that they might not have thought about for a number of years. So I might say to someone, well, you know, why are you looking at this molecule? I don't know anything about molecules. Explain to me why you're doing this and not that. And they've suddenly got to think, oh, I don't really know, or they, which can be a bit worrying. But you know, they've got to kind of go back to, well, what's the story? Tell me the story of your research, you know, explain where you've come from. And that can really force people to be quite reflective and to think again, and maybe to rethink some of their research ideas. And I think it can also just shift, I think Andrea mentioned, like the biomedical model. If people are sharing the experience of an illness, it can shift that emphasis on the biomedical to a much more sort of holistic way of looking at people, a much more sort of pluralistic way. So you can kind of challenge, you know, conceived wisdom and generate new ideas and new hypotheses. And many researchers have said to me and have written to me and said, you know, it's really increased my motivation for what I do, just speaking to people and working with people. And also it can build long-term relationships. We've talked about the difficulty of getting access to underserved groups. And, you know, Linda was saying that was one of the rationales for how they recruited. And if you recruit people who have access, I have access to a lot of networks of people, and I can bring them in and I can disseminate information, and you can build those relationships. So very, very important. I'm just going to finish with a couple of quotes from researchers actually that I got researchers, 50 researchers in mental health and others at a conference, just to write down anonymously whether they'd got any benefit out of it. And there was lots and lots of things, but I'll just read you a couple. And this was about writing. One researcher said, I stopped using a word subject and used patient instead. Originally, I was told off. A subject is not necessarily a patient yet, only a candidate. This was a basic scientist. So in a strict sense, it wasn't correct. But after working with patients, I just couldn't use that word anymore. And he'd never worked with patients before. Someone else, I presented my work differently with a more layered approach. So the key intuition behind the concept came first and the detail later. And there was many of them that mentioned how it had initially quite a disruptive effect working with patients, but that disruptive effect had been good once they'd got over it, that it had actually helped them quite a lot. It was a positive thing. Many talked about seeing the purpose behind the research and the motivation. My very favorite one actually, which was somebody who very seriously hadn't worked with patients, was a data scientist, and said, I never knew people with this condition could be happy, which I loved. I thought it was very funny because the group of patients with this condition were usually the first in the bar and the last to leave, and we're very happy. But because he'd just seen all the negative in his data, he'd never met patients with this condition and thought, actually, you know, they're quite happy. They're getting up in the morning, getting on with life. So it has a huge impact. And I think we have to think about it in that way, as impact, not just on the project, but on us and on the researchers. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Thank thank you so much, Jane. And as I can say from a group that were first in the bar last night and last to leave, I think we're all right this morning though. We had a good breakfast, so we're doing okay. At that point, I'd like to open the floor to ask any questions they feel. We do have one other bit to continue later on, but are there any questions that we can take at this point? Because we'd be very pleased to.
Thanks very much, Rudolph, Cambridge. I suppose one thing I just wanted to throw something to the general audience, in particular perhaps the researchers, because what several people have mentioned, Johnny, Jane, Andrea among them, is that imbalance in services that's perceived between mental and physical health and the problems of funding. And we know that as a country we're poorer than we were and so on. And we know that mental health funding has been odd. So, for example, some physical health treatments are funded on the basis of a per treatment cost. And we know that at least historically the NHS, for example, our area gets a certain amount of money and it's told make people's mental health better with that money. So it's a sort of a vague funding model. And my question is, how can we improve this politically? And are we doing the right thing in terms of data when we think about treatments for mental health disorders? So, for example, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence values the quality adjusted life year. Are we collecting that enough for mental health treatments to make the argument to NICE or to government for better funding for these treatments? And is that a thing that we need to be thinking about more as when we collect data in that context?
I feel that's a question definitely for the audience.
Oh yeah. Thank you for wonderful presentations and about how you can help influence what researchers do and how you're moving towards co-production. A question though, do you get a chance to influence a level up? Because what researchers do is what the funders want them to do, and influencing at that level would be even more impactful. Do you get a chance to influence at that level?
Yeah, shall I start with that one? Yeah, I didn't when I started, but because I've made a nuisance of myself, various things I do now. So yeah, so I for example, I'm on an advisory group to UKRI for the funders for Our Future Health on their inclusion and diversity as a lived experience expert. So I've gone to Parliament and talked to APPG groups, but I've had to fight to do that. And it's surprising how little is known at those levels. But I think, yes, if you make enough noise, you can. But I think in mental health, of course, people are very resistant to ask patients and carers, much more resistant than in physical health, often out of a sensitivity born of good intentions, but it's not always viable. It's not what they should be doing. They should be letting the person decide. Yeah, but I think increasingly people do get invited and come to the table more.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, similar experience to Jane. I sit on a patient benefit funding committee for Yorkshire and the North East as a lived experience expert, so very much at the sharp end of that. And in the 18 months I've been doing it, there has been a shift around PPI and around the content and around the detail. And if you do not have a detailed PPI plan that is fully funded, is reasonable, is going to work, those people in the room who are the lived experience experts are going to say, this is not going to work. You know, these people are not going to do this for that money. They're not going to be able to do this without training, without the proper plan, etc., etc. So yes, definitely. And also in another hat, I sit on a patient advisory board for a national charity. And we are asked questions that have a fundamental impact on what their work is all around. So definitely, yeah. I mean, it's tough. And you really have to, I always say you have to run to keep up, because you are starting from a different place and you have to learn what all the language is about before you can process it and make the decisions. So I always feel that we're running to keep up, but we're catching. Yeah, definitely.
And I think can I just say as well, from sort of DATAMIND perspective, it was very clear earlier on that Anne wanted patient public involvement to be involved at the management and leadership level. And so any decisions that are made there that go further up, you know, into higher bodies will always have the backing of the patient and public, you know, group, the super rag. So I think that's something that Anne was very clear from the start that she wanted.
Hi, can I ask you a question about your experience? You're very experienced in PPI now. And I suppose I've always thought there's a little bit of a tension there from my perspective as a researcher. So as a lived experience expert over time, do you think how you experience your illness and talk about your illness is now sort of, in some respects, a bit different because you've gone through this PPI journey? And is there some kind of tension there, if you see what I mean? So your experience might be different now from someone who's never had a PPI experience. Do you see what I'm saying? So when we're trying to understand what the experience is like for people with a lived condition, your experience now might be a little bit removed from what it's like for the patient population in general. I just thought from your perspective, since you're here, what you think of that.
I think it's quite difficult to separate the parts of your life, and you know, my mental health is my mental health. When I miss meetings because I forget about them, it's probably my ADHD, and that gets no better or worse because I'm on this panel. It just is. Or how I struggle when I see people I love really struggling with mental health issues and I can do nothing about it. I feel no better or worse because I'm on this panel. And so to some extent, I just don't see how does this make it better for me? Well, it makes it better because I feel like I'm doing something. Because quite often in mental health, you can't do anything for people who are struggling. They can't accept your help, or you're the wrong person to help maybe. So it feels like I'm maybe feeding a need within me to try and to talk about things. And certainly, geez, I've never told this many people before I've got ADHD, so that's a new thing, right? Does it make it easier to have it? Don't know. Do I still feel ashamed? Yes. Do I feel still, stupid, or, am I scared to write on a board because I'll misspell stuff? Absolutely. None of that changes. So I think what I'm saying is, I'm just talking, is that no, it doesn't change anything for me. It doesn't change anything at all, but it does make me feel like I'm actually having some kind of impact. And by the way, I'm not the answer. The answer is a wide cross-section of people involved in some way whose views can be got, because if we're going to create great new healthcare services in the future, it has to be driven by people and what they need and by their individual needs.
Can I just add to that? I think what you said is absolutely right. And I often say to people, no, I'm not the person for this, but I can put you in touch with people who will and who've not done it before, if you will support them, or I will support them. But also often patients are held to a much higher standard than researchers. I mean, I don't hear anyone saying to this researcher, well, you've been doing this for 15 years, you're too close to it. I'm sorry, but we'll need to get someone new. So I think we have to be aware of that.
Can I just add one final thing? For me, obviously, totally agree with what both colleagues have said. It hasn't changed my conditions and those around me, but what it has done is it's given me the confidence to talk about it. And I would say that fundamentally what you would need, you want a mixture of people who have that confidence and that people who are new to it and who really want to talk but maybe don't have the confidence, because the people like us with the confidence will start the conversation and bring them into it, and then you'll get the amazing rich data from the entire group. So I think, the one change is the confidence to talk about it, but the conversation's still the same. You're just probably more vocal.
And I think one of the things we did have or have had recently in DATAMIND, one of the projects we're working on is looking at developing some guidelines for industry around sharing mental health data. And Jan and I have been working on that alongside another colleague, Hina, who's not here today. And Hina comes from completely new to patient public involvement. She's never done anything like it before. And Jan obviously is relative experience. And it's been really interesting to see the way they've both come at it at that different angle, but they have fundamentally got to the same place. And so it was around things like training. Jan was like, oh, we don't need any training. And Hina was like, oh, we need lots and lots of training. And actually they've sort of met in the middle and sort of agreed, you know, and then, so it's been a really interesting experience, hasn't it? Looking at how someone completely new and someone, but they have met in the middle, and it has been a really good experience. And I think that's one, as I said at the start, one thing great about this group, the people here today are relatively experienced, but we do have 5 people who have, you know, who have no experience at all of doing this, and their voice, we make sure their voice is heard. And that is so important, as Jan said, in a research advisory group, that everybody has the opportunity to speak and give their opinions. And we feel actually one of the things you have to do is make it a safe environment for people to be able to do that and feel confident to do that.
Can I just add to that is my experience is really education, learning from others, not feeling on your own, because your family sector might not have any problems and you're the black sheep, you know, you're behaving very differently and bizarrely. And when you're actually with people like yesterday, you know, you're feeling so confident, but also safe talking. And that's all you really need, is feeling safe and being listened to, you know. And I'm sure if we can actually encourage that and increase that in the future, I mean, we will be moving forward. Because it's all right to burn, oh, don't go by him, he's naughty, or oh, you'll catch that. It's none of that. It's coming together and accepting and understanding, really.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. For our final piece, and we will then take questions from the panel afterwards, but for our final sort of section, if you like, or presentation, we decided not to do a presentation at this point because we thought you might be presented out throughout the day. We weren't quite sure, but we're going to talk about PPI squared, and that's what the title that the group came up with, and that's patient public involvement from a patient public involvement perspective. So that's why it got somehow shortened in one of the meetings, which caused great merriment. I'm not quite sure why, but anyway, it was good fun. And one of the things, as I'm being James now, I'm talking to my panel here, we asked everyone to come up with what they thought was the biggest challenge about anything patient public involvement related, and what tips they would give you to get past those challenges. And obviously, once we've done that, that's going to lead into us asking you, what challenges do you have, so that we can give you back some tips to get past those challenges, because we all agree there are challenges working with patients and public. We've heard about some of them today. So we've pre-set these questions, and we'll try and keep it relatively brief. But I'm going to start with Andrea, who's going to talk about some challenges around accessibility.
Yeah. To start off with, not all disabilities are visible. So can I just point out, I've got a white piece of paper there with black writing on. On the screen there, there's black print on white. If I stayed here all day and I had that, I would have a blinding headache, you'd lose my concentration. I've actually got dyslexia and Erling's, and you cannot keep my attention when my eyes, it's like being on a computer day in and day out. In order to be able to keep that retention is to actually break things up, but also, does it actually take an awful lot of money or thought just to take that white away? It only needs to be like a cream or something light, so the sharpness. Just imagine that all of you are wearing goggles and you've got Vaseline on the front of them. And I'm asking you to listen to me and watch all my presentations today. Are you going to be interested on what I'm saying? You know, my experience of coming down the last 2 days, I've had to wait for a taxi for 20 minutes just to do 8 minutes journey. So, of course, I did get very upset and very anxious and everything because everyone else has gone ahead of me. I'm there waiting, think it's going to be late and everything. And it's only because at present, I'm not confident as well to go in the middle of the road to flag down a taxi. I'm having trouble with my recovery on the sit to stand. So instead of being stuck with a black cab, not being able to get in, it's like having a wheelchair and everyone's there looking and wondering, you know, the traffic and that. So it's really, think of the person that you are going to include, and just a few questions, you know, like you talk about dietaries, and they don't need to be such a big problem. And it's just thinking out of that box creatively. And we don't need to feel sort of like less of a service, because no one wants to be a bother. But I would have liked to have been here a lot earlier. I'm texting frantically to Linda thinking, am I going to be sent home? You know, and I'm not going to arrive here, because that's it. You're relying on other people, you know, to me. But this is it. I mean, you look at the person and you assume. I worked for the Welsh Assembly government, and when they were actually doing a little bit on disability, they didn't think, you know, of certain things, because we only actually acknowledge that when we're experiencing it. So if you want good feedback, you know, don't just look at what you can see in front of you and sort of either diss or whatever. Speak to that person, and I bet you it's like open a book, and you will know through what you will get out that person.
Thank you,
can
Anne.
help.
Thank you. Jan.
I'm going to do the challenges and the tips that Linda tells me are the most difficult for PPI leads. So wish me luck, here I go. So I'm going to look at how you can involve your group equally in discussions, how you manage those difficult conversations, how you manage monopolising of conversations, how you manage straying away from the work in hand and not allowing other people to speak, and involving underserved groups and making sure your materials are accessible. So I'm going to break it down for you. Some of it is incredibly basic, but I just thought this is how it came out of my head. So I'm just going to share it with you. So back to basics, the meeting etiquette. Obviously, if you're on Zoom, you're going to raise your hand. You're not going to speak over others. You're going to respect all the views and the differences. And the biggie is you're going to agree to disagree on occasions, because if you have a PPI group and they agree on everything, A, your data is not going to be very rich, and B, it's going to be boring and you're not really going to achieve anything. But you have to agree to disagree on occasions. As Andrew has alluded to, always check accessibility with your group, and remember that accessibility issues can be temporary and they can fluctuate. So obviously you need to ask the people that you're providing it for, ask them what they need. And obviously black text on a white background affects so many people. Everybody has a story, and some people have not actually processed their story until they come into your group. So that's a big thing to be aware of. And also offering places where they can express that, not particularly as part of your group, things like Care Opinion, where you can actually put on your experience of NHS services, and it is monitored and it is listened to. And I think that's very cathartic for some people. Obviously, if you truly want to represent people with mental health issues, you have to find those people who may not be articulate, maybe don't see PPI as relevant to them, and that then becomes a very challenging task to show it how it is relevant to them. And this is hard work. This is not an easy option by no means. But if you go down the easy option, again, you're not going to get the rich data that you need. You can involve support groups, you can involve community groups to help you bring these people into your work, and it will be incredibly rewarding to do that. Managing the difficult conversations. As I've already said, everyone has a story about healthcare. It may be good, it may be bad, it may not have even been processed. It may involve really bad experiences and even death in some cases, and we need to be aware of that. Some people are desperate to get that information out there. Some people are not ready to share, and obviously that also needs to be managed. And I would say that in your first encounter with your group, let those stories be heard. They may not be relevant to the study you're doing, but they're incredibly relevant to those people. So let them be heard, let them be listened to. And then after that's done and you've offered them experiences like that, you've offered them a website where they can share that with the NHS, then you can be more directional, then you can look at the real work and the real reasons why they're there. You need to thank them for their candour. It's very difficult to share your personal stories. We're all testament to that. I wouldn't have been able to do this a few years ago, and DATAMIND's massively helped me and given me the confidence to share my mental health experiences. So yeah, good luck with that. Not easy, but well worth it. So how do you ensure everybody's involved as equally as possible? Effective sharing is huge here. Stick to your agenda, share your agenda in advance, stick to your timings wherever possible. Ask people if they want to say anything at the end of the session, even if they've not raised their hand, because they may be dying to speak. Offer them the chat option if you're on Zoom, offer them a one-to-one by email. They may be desperate to share something, but just don't have the confidence. And just put yourself in their shoes, they may not be able to do that. And at the next meeting, always have a quick recap of what you did in the last meeting, just so that everybody's on the same page and it's at the front of everyone's mind. Monopolising conversations. You could have someone who really has so much to say, but isn't really interested in what anyone else has got to say. And that needs managing. Put in time constraints, offer that person other options, email options, one-to-one chats. And after a reasonable time, maybe say, well, we really need to move on now because we've only got X number, but we really want to hear the rest of the conversation at another time. Be very vigilant online about who's got the hand up. Try to take people in order. Don't make people feel they're being ignored. Again, not easy because you're probably frantically making notes at the same time. So I do understand it's difficult. Bringing the conversation and make it very focused. I think if you have a PPI plan, which obviously would be the best course of action, and you do have to have it for your funding, share your plan, be very open, share the plan, share the ideas, share what you're hoping to achieve, share the journey of how you think you're going to get there. They may have other ideas, your plan may be very dynamic, but share it and reinforce every time that you will allow at the end time for final thoughts and things like that. And just ensure that your meeting etiquette becomes standard, and you may need to reinforce it, but eventually those people will have the confidence and they'll be able to work within those parameters. And obviously you will get that data. So all I'm going to say by way of an end is good luck. Lived experience is a hugely rich, hugely powerful data source, and it's well worth putting in the work to get out what you're going to get. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I'm now slightly worried about how my performance is being monitored in our meetings. So I think I've just note to self, must do better.
What I have actually found out, because you're dealing with the PPI, always have a glossary, because you guys talk in a different language, and when you like saying JP and everyone's like knowing what you're saying, and the poor person's thinking JP, and they've lost, they lost that thread. So always have a glossary, and then you know that everyone's on the same hymn sheet.
Yeah. Andrew and I often have a catch up after meetings, don't we? Just to check in that we've understood what's going on. So it is really valuable to that person who's leading those conversations to understand which people need that further contact. So I think on to Michael.
Oh, me. Okay. So mine's quite simple and quite personal. Is that so I said before, I work developing AI and digital health tools. I'm really passionate about it. I love it. I sort of think it's the future, but I'm here on this panel because of my lived experience, and I sort of wonder about how those two things interplay, because I'm here to talk about my lived experience, not to talk about how ChatGPT could be game changing, but probably isn't right now in terms of AI interfaces with people. Right? I know about it, but it's not really why I'm here. But in truth, I'm both of those things. Right? I'm not just purely my experience of mental health. I'm not just purely, someone who understands digital health. I'm both of those things. And what I understood by thinking about this question is that what this has allowed me to do and develop is to be open and honest about how I experience life and the experience of my life that have been difficult and challenging, and what's helped, what's not. And that's all true. And it's also, those are the things that motivated me to start working in digital health too. But it's also allowed me to understand other people more and be accepting of their experience and their views. I think, Jan said it beautifully, we have to accept we're going to disagree about stuff, and our experiences are quite different. That's one of the challenges, I suppose, of mental health, is that we all experience it quite differently. So that's really, the challenge for me was maybe finding my space and being a lived experience person who also works in mental health. But for me, it was this environment that allowed me to be okay with that and, start to be much more open and honest about how I experience life. So.
Thank you, Michael. Jane, did you want to?
I just done a very, very quick one because everybody's said such kind of really important things. And I apologise for my slides. I'm always learning. That was my bad. Black and white. I won't do that again. But I think it's really important to check expectations at the start. Often when you set up a PPI group or a research advisory group, you assume that everybody's got the same expectations, and they don't. And that's one thing I've learned over the years, that it's really important, even just to formalise it, to sit down and think, well, what are the expectations here? Have a kind of almost like a terms of reference, how much time is expected? You'd be amazed how many people don't pay and don't tell you whether they're going to pay or not. I've worked for an organisation for years that rarely pays me. I'm still doing it because I'm committed, but, these expectations need to be set out. Who do you talk to if there's an issue? Who's your contact person? If you leave that and don't, are nervous about that, you're more likely to end up with unhappy people on both sides. And I think also recognising there's always power relationships there between researchers and patients. Not always how you might think, but there are always, and being aware of those power relationships and how you might be contributing.
Thank you, Jane. And inviting them out for a glass of wine really does help.
With a straw.
I don't know how much time we've got left. 5 minutes. So yes, absolutely. But is there some questions from the floor that we can take? Oh, there's some hands.
Hi, Bettina, you mentioned training at some point, and I was wondering if you sort of thinking back to your journey, kind of like starting this and sort of until now, were there any like training needs or anything where you thought, oh, that would have been nice to know at the beginning when we started this, or anything that would have helped you in your role?
I think the easy answer is lots, absolutely tons at the beginning. But I think one of the things for me is you tend to think of formal training, and sometimes all that's actually needed is time, your time and their time, to share your skills and to train each other. Yes, there might be times where you can advise them to look at a website or read an article, but there's no substitute for you imparting that knowledge. And they might ask you a question you don't know, so you're learning from them and they're learning from you. So, but yeah, the easy answer is lots of training.
I think as well, there's some simple things that we don't think about. So one of the things that we put in our advert was that, do you need training on Zoom? Because some people have never used Zoom before. Yeah, obviously more now so, perhaps, but in those days, you perhaps wouldn't think of that actually someone might go, oh, you're going to do all your meetings by Zoom. I have no idea how to Zoom. I don't even know how I get a count. So by telling people that if they, something simple at the start as a Zoom training, or, that they're things to think about. So right at that early level. And then it's really working on as to what people need. And if, for example, Rob, who I know is in the audience, one of the things we're coming up against in our guidelines work is natural language processing. I know nothing about, we guys don't know too much about. So Rob has offered to come and give us a talk. So things will come up during the course of the work as well, that, we can invite these wonderful people from DATAMIND in to talk to us about. So, but it is thinking back to those basics. It's not always a specific training. And again, I do some work for our biomedical research centre and there is no training out there for patients and public on translational research and what the omics are and things like that. And that's something, if anyone was interested in developing, would be lovely to see. But it's things like that as well. I think there was one more hand somewhere.
Thank you. I was just hoping if you could talk a bit more about how you fed back to your various communities that you've all come from.
For me, for an example, was a lot of forums. So it could be a county-wide or led by the health board, different charities. When I worked for a Pacific charity, it was Reactivate, and I used to actually ask if I could actually come and do some talks. So that's, to be able to say what we do for a charity. So it's all about communication, really. Or I think if you have the right person, I would say, which is actually enthusiastic, and that you're going to go to the right place, or you don't want me to sit here and have all your knowledge and it's not going to go anywhere. So it's and being creative. I do think that thinking out the box is the most important thing, and holistically, if that's answered your question. Yeah. Thank you.
I think that's a great question. I was just sort of contemplating what my answer was. I think I talk about what we do here a lot in the communities in which I live. So a lot of that is around digital health in Scotland specifically. So I might be bending the ear of people in NHS boards about why aren't they involved in this type of thing, or why don't they take this approach, or why is it so damn difficult to talk to anybody, or things like that. Also in the environment of that I work as in AI and digital health, I'll talk about the work that's going on, maybe talk about some of the projects which are interesting, or maybe some that I think are brilliant, some that I'm more dubious about, but it's an opportunity to push things out in that way. And thirdly, again, I also work, one of my other jobs is as a counsellor and psychotherapist. And so in that community, challenging people around data in an area where a lot of counsellors would say, well, you can't really measure stuff. We shouldn't really be, gathering data. And I'm like, well, hold on a second. Surely we should. And sort of creating, I think it's made me more confident to talk to these different groups and to really argue about stuff and sort of challenge the norms, if you like.
I think I've shared similar to Andrea with charities. But I think there's also, we talk about communities and you think about where you live and those local communities, and that's great. But there's also the PPI community. So whatever PPI group you're on, and we're all probably on several, there's a crossover of knowledge, and you can have done something in one group that you can then share and think, well, this worked. Or conversely, you can say, well, don't do that, it's rubbish, forget it, it's not going to work, which saves a lot of time and a lot of money and funding and things. So I think you're sharing with lots of different communities. I think, yeah, you do, and sometimes you're even doing it subconsciously because you're saying things and you think, oh, well, that happened in another group, but it's still relevant here. And also for me, I do some one-to-ones with PhD students at my local university, looking at their PhD work and the things that they're going to do, the research they're going to do, and sort of giving that PPI perspective. And I find I can bring so much from other areas and sort of explain to them things that I've done while they're explaining to me things that they've done. And it's incredibly rich to do that. So yeah, there's lots of community opportunity, definitely.
And there's not just academic communities as well, is there? I mean, like, I live in Manchester, in the area that I live in, there's massive diversity, there's lots of community groups, carer groups. Up the road from I live down the road from a big mosque, and they put on all kinds of things. Everybody knows someone with mental health problems. And if you are happy to go in and talk and involve people, they're interested. They're always interested. It's a topic that really gets people interested and they want to talk about it. So I think you just have to have the confidence to go into places and say, right, this is what I'm doing. Is anyone interested? And I've never not been welcomed in that way, and then you build more networks and you can use those networks to get more people involved in PPI that are from underserved groups.
Thank you. And I think we're just about out of time. So I'd like to say before I say a huge thank you, one thing we would like to do, in the coffee room, there is a whiteboard, not a whiteboard, a paper, I think it's paper and pen. Thank you, flip chart, that's the word. Yeah, it was there earlier, hope it's still there. We would really welcome any more questions, and particularly any questions that perhaps you haven't felt you could ask us, haven't had time today, or that you felt you didn't want to ask but just wanted to write down. So we welcome you putting any questions on that flip chart, and we can send our answers back through MQ as a sort of a roundup of this meeting. So we're very happy to do that. But obviously what remains for me to do is to say a huge thank you to Andrea, to Jane, Michael and Jan for coming today, for laying themselves bare, for drinking all the wine last night. And but for coming out today, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your time, and we really appreciate your time as being part of DATAMIND. You've made such a difference to the project that we're so grateful. So thank you.
Can I just quickly say before we finish, because I've done it without Linda, and thanks to Linda.